So today we're going to talk about reversing insulin resistance and how long you can expect that to take. We've talked a lot about the fact that insulin resistance is reversible in just about every instance, but we haven't really talked about what that looks like and how long you can expect that process to take. Now, with a lot of things regarding chronic illness, chronic disease, it's a really gray area. There's not like one definitive timeline that everybody's going to follow in order to see complete reversal and remission of the insulin resistance process. There are a lot of factors that come into play here. Number one being how long you have struggled with insulin resistance and how advanced your disease process has been. So someone who has very slight insulin resistance and it's really just started to develop, maybe they're just starting to see some elevated blood sugars, they're just starting to see some weight gain and see some metabolic changes, their blood pressure starting to creep up, that person may resolve and reverse their disease process much more quickly than someone who has long-standing type 2 diabetes, requires insulin, requires a lot of medication, has been weight loss resistant or obese for decades. In that case, that will take a lot longer to reverse. So we want to look at a few criteria so we kind of know what we're actually dealing with the insulin resistance reversal process. And so remember, insulin resistance is basically just not being able to utilize carbohydrate and energy efficiently. You are not getting the energy into the cell that you're eating. Your body has become so accustomed to high levels of insulin for so long that it's basically not listening to that insulin hormone anymore. Insulin directs energy into the cell. And if it's in very high levels all the time, the insulin receptors in your body just start to resist it and say, nope, that energy, I don't need more energy in my cell. I have quite enough. Thank you. And insulin can run high. So we're going to look at some lab values. We're going to look at overall glucose levels. We're going to look at hemoglobin A1C. We're going to look at fasting insulin. From there, we can kind of determine our level of insulin resistance at any given time based on those labs that you can request. Now, keep in mind that the reversal process is a long-term process, and developing insulin resistance and prediabetes, fatty liver, type 2 diabetes is a long-term process. It's not like a switch just flips in your body one day and all of a sudden you're pre-diabetic. You usually have high levels of insulin for years to maybe even decades before those blood sugars start to show up as chronically elevated. Your body is going to do all it can to keep a really tight gauge on your overall blood sugar and glucose. It needs to be in a finite range. And if it goes below or above that, your body will do anything it can to keep that level. So if you've been having high blood sugars for a long time because you eat too much carbohydrate, you eat too much sugar, you eat too much starch, you don't get enough activity, you eat too often throughout the day. And that's what we do here when we follow the standard American diet. You have been pushing your blood sugars up for a really long time, and the pancreas has been responding with high levels of insulin for years to decades. And your blood sugar may look normal, your hemoglobin A1C may look normal, but your body has just been pushing out higher levels of insulin in order to deal with that blood sugar. And that's how insulin resistance develops. So this is a long-term process. Like I said, it's not like a switch is flipped and all of a sudden one day you just have prediabetes. Like this has been developing for usually blood sugars and high insulin have been going on for usually a decade or two that you've had elevated insulin before those blood sugars actually show up as prediabetes and type 2 diabetes. So keep that in mind. So many people have been insulin resistant for months, years, decades prior to any disease process being diagnosed. So it's a long-term process that requires some long-term therapies and interventions. So there are some dramatic steps that can be taken to reverse the disease process, but let's talk about glucose first, because most people are pretty familiar with that and they've had that test done at some point. But like I said, by the time your blood sugars are elevated chronically, there has been some high insulin in the body for a long, long time. So the blood sugars are kind of the last thing to show up as elevated. So we'll use that as one parameter. And here in the United States, I know we do everything different here, but over 100 is where you're going to be flagged in a fasting glucose. Over 100 is going to be flagged as prediabetes, and then over 120, and usually it's 2 fasting glucose lab values that you are diagnosed. So anywhere in that 100 to 120 range, your glucose, if you get 2 readings, you're going to be flagged as pre-diabetic. And if you have over 120 more than once, you will be diagnosed as type 2 diabetes. So that's kind of what we're looking at for glucose. So we want to look at that for insulin resistance. We also want to look at glycosylated hemoglobin, or hemoglobin A1C. And that is the average of your blood sugars over the past 3 months or so. And I've talked about this lab value before. It's a great indication of your average blood sugars. The downfall of hemoglobin A1C is if you are dipping into the hypoglycemic range a lot of times. Like you have high blood sugars, but then you are going hypoglycemic and blood sugars are too low, and you really do not have good blood sugar control at all. You may show up as having a pretty good average for your hemoglobin A1C because you're having low and high, and those will kind of average each other out. But we want to look at that as well. And then we want to look at fasting insulin. We definitely want to try and get that lab value, if so, because then we can figure out the HOMA-IR score, which is the homeostatic assessment for insulin resistance. So if we have the fasting glucose, we can multiply it by the fasting insulin, divide by 405, and then we get a number. We want that number less than 1.6. Anything over like 1.9 to 2.5-ish, or 1.6 to 2.5-ish is kind of starting starting insulin resistance. And then over 2.5 is more severe advanced insulin resistance. So we definitely want to look at that insulin number as well. And then we also want to look at medications, because obviously a lot of people want to come off their medications. That kind of goes along with reversing that disease process. You're put on medications for your blood sugar, for your insulin, and usually to try to make the pancreas work better, or for the cells or the cell receptors to become more insulin resistant. But that's another thing that we want to look at, is definitely being able to discontinue, lower, come off of medications completely as we reverse the insulin resistance process. So those are kind of the things that we want to look at. So let's talk about when we know whether or not the disease process is reversing or has been reversed. And there are 2 other things that I want for you to keep in mind. And one of them is kind of this idea of like a muscle memory, or your body being like a set point. You've probably heard that term, the set point, before, but sometimes it takes a really long time for your body to change its set point. Meaning if, you've gained some weight over time, and you're 180 pounds and you seem like you're stuck there. You're not gaining, but you're not losing. Like you've been there for like 10 years. And whatever it is that you seem to do, your exercise, your food intake, your day to day, you're just kind of stuck at that 180. It's over where you want to be healthfully, but you just can't seem to move that. And that is what is known as a set point. Like your body just kind of becomes accustomed to your weight, your metabolic processes, your nutrition, your exercise, that sort of thing. So that's another thing to think about when we're talking about reversing this disease process and losing weight and reversing and overcoming obesity. It's like if you've been obese or type 2 diabetic for a really, really long time, your body kind of has the muscle memory or the set point to be obese and to be type 2 diabetic. It's not a normal state, but the longer you've been there, the harder you have to work to truly put your disease state in remission and to stay there. And then, of course, we have genetic predisposition. You can typically overcome genetics and you don't turn on the genes that are going to cause a disease process, which would be epigenetics. So epigenetics is basically when you have the genetic predisposition to develop a disease or a disease process, but whether or not those cells or those disease states are going to be turned on or off is known as epigenetics. So I'm a good example of this. I have very strong type 2 diabetes in my dad's family. Like all of his siblings have it. He has it. His dad have it, and heart disease. Like the men in my dad's side have pretty much all passed away in their 60s due to heart disease. And they all had type 2 diabetes when they passed away, or the vast majority, and his sisters as well. So it's there. I will talk more about my own fasting insulin here in a few minutes, but the genetic predisposition can be strong, but your lifestyle really, for the most part, is going to determine the epigenetics and whether or not you're actually going to turn on that disease process. So I was talking about the lab values and knowing when you reverse the disease process and how to measure that. So I talked about how glucose is basically the last thing to really be elevated and to really put you in the category of prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, or fatty liver if you have elevated liver enzymes. Like those are basically the last thing to be elevated because your body's been working really, really hard to keep homeostasis and not get into that disease state. So when we reverse it, we kind of see the reverse effect. So when we start to bring down our levels of carbohydrate, we start to incorporate some intermittent fasting or some longer fasts. Glucose is the first thing that can change, and it can change pretty dramatically, pretty quickly. Like we're talking, you can reverse those blood sugar values or at least start to lower them within a couple hours, within a couple days, within a couple of months. So obviously we are going to have people who have had chronically elevated blood sugars for a really long time, and it's going to take some time to bring those down into normal range. And the important thing that you want to look for when that is you, like say you're in the 150s to 160s, like that's your average, and you're really wanting to bring those blood sugars down. Those can come down pretty dramatically with fasting because you're not taking in any food, and therapeutic carb restriction because you're not taking in the carbohydrates, the sugar, the starches that drive up those blood sugars in the first place. But you want to look for trends. So if you're in the 150s, 160s, maybe a month later, you're in the 140s, 150s. Your blood sugars are still elevated, yes, but you're at least trending in the right direction. And then a couple months later, you're in the 120s to 130s. Still not perfect by any means. You still have work to do, but at least they're trending in the right direction. And usually for blood sugar, those morning blood sugars can be the hardest to really correct due to the dawn effect, due to a lot of factors and hormonal fluctuations that are happening overnight, which is a whole other podcast. But those morning blood sugars can be the last to kind of correct themselves. But blood glucose can change pretty quickly. And you can have relatively normal blood sugars within about 3 to 6 months, a lot of times, maybe a year, depending on how long-standing your disease process was. But those can change relatively quickly. And that's why when you're working on reversing the insulin resistance process and reversing your disease, you want to have a practitioner on board who can quickly adjust medications for you. If necessary, if you're on type 2 diabetes medications or any insulin, blood pressure medication, for sure, that can sometimes need to be adjusted fairly quickly when you take in less carbohydrate and start some fasting. Those can change, and you need to have somebody in your corner who can start to change your prescription or to discontinue your medications pretty quickly. But the glucose can change fairly quickly. Now, the insulin, and also, what goes along with that is obviously the hemoglobin A1C, which is more of an average of your blood sugars over the past 3 months or so. We've talked about that on the podcast as well. So that's the glycosylated hemoglobin, and you're basically looking at hemoglobin cells, the red blood cells, and how much sugar is stuck to the cells. So that is how hemoglobin A1C is measured. But a red blood cell lives for about 3 months. So we can look at, the sugar that's kind of stuck on that cell. We get a good indication of the average blood sugar over the last 3 months. And so the hemoglobin A1C is going to start to come down as those blood sugars come down. But because it's a 3-month average, you truly don't see a really good trend, the trending coming down for a couple of months, after you start a low carb lifestyle and you start some intermittent fasting, because it's an average. But over the course of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, you will see that hemoglobin A1C trending in the right direction and starting to come down closer to the normal range. I like to see hemoglobin A1C less than 5.4%. I know most conventional systems say under 5.7 is disease-free. I like, for good blood sugar control, under 5.4. Some practitioners, holistic, naturopathic, say 5.1. I think if we can get you under 5.4, you're pretty clear of metabolic disease at that point, and your blood sugars are pretty well managed. So that is the what to look for with that test. Now, with fasting insulin, that has been elevated for years or decades. It takes a long time to see progress in that area. So don't expect your fasting insulin to come down into normal range within 3 months or 6 months. Like, it's going to take a while, because remember that the elevated insulin starts way before you see the glucose chronically elevated. So in a metabolically healthy person, you see glucose rise and you see insulin rise with it at about the same amount. With elevated, if you keep going and you're pushing over that threshold of where you should be for sugar and carbohydrate, your pancreas starts to push out more and more insulin. And so then we get this imbalance, and your body's keeping your glucose relatively stable, but it's pushing out more and more insulin. So that process can go on for years or decades. So when we're reversing it, you can expect that fasting insulin to come down much slower. It's not a fast process. Sometimes that takes years to actually come back into normal range, sometimes even longer. And I will use myself as a good example. I've only been testing my fasting insulin since July of 2022 is the first time I got a fasting insulin, because, we just didn't measure it before then. So I've been doing intermittent fasting and a low carb approach since, when was it? 2018 is when I started to kind of just do intermittent fasting here and there. 2019 is where I really started to do it pretty much every day. And so by the time I got my fasting insulin checked in July of 2022, I'd been at this lifestyle for 3 years and I was not overweight. My fasting insulin was 10, and I thought it was a fluke. I like to see fasting insulin, very, very healthy levels of fasting insulin, less than 6, and I was at 10. So 6 to 12 is that kind of starting insulin resistance. And then over 12 is more long-standing insulin resistance. So I was at 10, and here I was, very appropriate weight. My cholesterol panel looked great. My glucose had never been problematic, other than when I was pregnant. I did flunk the glucose test one time, but I was never, I never had diabetes while I was pregnant or anything like that. But I had been intermittent fasting for 3 years and my fasting insulin was 10. So I have no idea what it was when I actually started this lifestyle. I wish I did. I've never had abnormal blood sugars. I did have issues with hypoglycemia. When I was more, when I ate a lot of carbohydrate, but I have no idea where I was at. And I was probably pretty insulin resistant and had no idea that I was. I mean, it was getting harder and harder to manage my weight by the time I started some intermittent fasting. And just overall, I was in my 40s. I felt good. But if I hadn't turned my lifestyle around, I would probably, enter my my perimenopausal years thinking, oh, this is just how it is. Now I'm in my 40s. Now I'm going to start to gain weight around my middle. No, like I was insulin resistant. So now I got it rechecked in January. So 6 months later, and it was 7.5. So it was still slightly elevated. I like to, as I said, I like to see it under 6, but my glucose was 66. So you might be thinking, holy crap, like your glucose was really low. And it was, but I felt fine. Like when I did my test, I was fine. I was burning ketones for energy along with glucose. So my body, it didn't ever feel like I was hypoglycemic or I wasn't like super hungry or anything. Like I transitioned to fat burning and carb burning. So that blood sugar of 66 was not problematic for me, but my blood sugars came down. Like I said, they've never been high, but I usually was like in the 80s, and here I was at 66. And my fasting insulin had start to recover also, but it took me 6 months to bring it down a couple of points. And like I said, I am not overweight. I have lived a low carb lifestyle for years. I've intermittent fasted for years. And it's really interesting how that fasting insulin can take a while to see progress there. So don't get discouraged. So if your blood sugars are starting to respond and your hemoglobin A1C is starting to respond, that fasting insulin will start to resolve itself and it will start to come down into normal range if you are consistent and patient. But excuse me, here I am. I would still like to bring my insulin down even a little bit more. But when I look at my HOMA-IR score, my HOMA-IR score is 1.2. So it's really low. And remember, I get that by taking my fasting insulin and multiplying it by my fasting glucose and then dividing by 405. So I take 66 times 7.5, divide by 405, and I get 1.2. That's my HOMA-IR score, which is very low. Under 1.6 is no insulin resistance. So I have brought myself out of the insulin resistant stage, but it took time, commitment, persistence, and doing this lifestyle every single day for 4 years, maybe 5. I can't remember exactly. I think it was 4 years that I was really consistent with it. And like I said, I never had any long-standing disease. I was probably just starting to get there. So I was in the starting insulin resistance phase, and it's taken me this long to get a pretty normal fasting insulin. So that takes a while to resolve itself, which makes sense because the fasting insulin is elevated far up in front of fasting glucose. So the glucose will correct itself pretty quickly. The hemoglobin A1C will correct itself pretty quickly. You can usually come off some medications because the medications are there to help with the blood sugars. And then you can watch your fasting insulin over time and make sure that it's trending in the right direction. Now, there are certain things that are going to speed up the process of reversing insulin resistance. For sure, all the things that I teach. So the number one thing that speeds up reversing insulin resistance and will speed up this process is fasting. I'm not saying we want to overfast and we want to do it too much. And we, like females need to pay attention to their hormones and they need to fast at the right times if they're menstruating. We need to pay attention to all of that. But fasting is the most potent tool to reverse insulin resistance because it lets your insulin come down lower than anything else. So 20 hours of fasting or so is when insulin really starts to come down. And so I talk about therapeutic fasts a lot, but those therapeutic fasts are what really help to reverse the disease process. Now, again, you don't want to overdo it, but a 36 to 42 hour fast once a week, maybe twice a week, that is going to speed up the process of reversing insulin resistance. Now, I have a lot of people who fast 16 hours a day, 18 hours a day, and they've been doing that for a couple of years, and they're super frustrated because they're like, I'm stuck. Fasting doesn't work for me. Well, 16 hours to 18 hours of fasting is typically a maintenance protocol for most people. So, and then I just talked to a student of mine today. Like she was saying, I've been stuck in the same I've been stuck at the same weight, 50 pounds overweight, and the same range of hemoglobin A1C. My disease process is not advancing, but it's been between 6.4 and 6.8 for the last 2 years. I cannot move this. But her level of fasting is 16 to 18 hours every day. So she's in a maintenance protocol. She's not in a disease reversal protocol for her. She's type 2 diabetic. She's over that threshold of where she's going to reverse her disease process doing 16 to 18 hours of fasting every day. So we talked about eventually adding some therapeutic fasts in so she can actually reverse the disease process. So if you add those therapeutic fasts in, you're going to reverse this disease process much more quickly than if you just do intermittent fasting every day. The second thing that's really potent and a powerful strategy is a ketogenic diet. So bringing your carbohydrate level down under 40 grams per day. In most circumstances, it needs to be under 40 in order for you to be ketogenic and be burning fatty acids. So you're not putting the sugar in, you're not putting the carbohydrates, the starches, all of the foods in that raise blood sugar and raise insulin. So we're reversing that process. So a ketogenic diet is the second thing that is very, very potent to help speed along the process. The third thing being a low carb, high fat diet or a low carb, healthy fat diet. That's what I follow. That would be more like under 100 grams of carbohydrates, somewhere in that range where you're not in the ketogenic range of always burning fatty acids for fuel. You're sometimes utilizing carbohydrates as well. But at least staying under 100 grams and adding in the fasting that can help move the process along. The next thing would be keeping stress and cortisol managed, because when you have high stress, you don't sleep well, your cortisol is elevated. You are not going to reverse this disease process as quickly because when cortisol is elevated, blood sugars are elevated, which elevates insulin. So it's counterintuitive to reversing the insulin resistance process. So managing stress. And then the last thing, the last tool that's really going to help you reverse that insulin resistance process is exercise and strength training in particular, because strength training allows you to preserve muscle mass, maybe even increase muscle mass, and it helps you become more insulin sensitive. So you have more glycogen stores, you have more area to store carbohydrates. When you do eat carbohydrates, you're not shuttling that carbohydrate to the liver. It's going to the muscles instead to be used for fuel. If your muscles are all full of fuel already, you're going to have to shuttle that energy to the liver, and the liver is going to have to decide what to do with it. So if you can bring in regular exercise, strength training, walking after meals, and why I preach walking after meals or any kind of exercise after meals, it doesn't have to be walking. It can be house cleaning. It can be doing some squats. It can be doing, a little bit of resistance training in your living room, like doing some tricep extensions in your living room while you're watching TV. It doesn't have to be walking. But what helps with exercise after you eat is that you're going to utilize that fuel in the bloodstream right away. So you're pulling the energy from the bloodstream and the muscles are burning it up and utilizing it for fuel. So it never has to signal your pancreas to release insulin because you've already burned it up. Because remember, the pancreas releases insulin in response to higher blood sugars. So if you burned out the blood sugar before it ever, tells the pancreas to release insulin, that is going to be super helpful. So that would be the last thing that really helps to reverse speed up that reversal process. So I can't say definitively, yes, you're going to reverse your disease process within 6 months. Like, it's different for everyone. It's different with how hard you hit these therapies that I've been talking about, whether you do some therapeutic fast, whether you do a ketogenic approach of less than 40 grams of carbohydrate, how much strength training and exercising you're adding in. And then where did you start? Where did you start? Were you really insulin resistant and you've had high levels of insulin for decades? It's going to take more time for you. So there's no definitive timeline. Now, some people will even question, is this metabolic issue, is type 2 diabetes, is fatty liver, obesity, is it truly reversible? Is it truly in remission? And you get some different opinions about that, but here are my thoughts on that. So if we get to the point of reversal where your labs are normal, you have normal glucose, you have normal hemoglobin A1C, you have normal insulin, fasting insulin levels, you're no medications, you're declared disease-free. You have to look at everything that you did to reverse that disease process and put it into remission. Now, a lot of people say, well, once I get to that point, can I go back to eating normal? Which drives me crazy, because eating normal in our society is eating the standard American diet that, quite frankly, sucks. It's terrible. It's loaded with chemicals and toxins and sugar and inflammatory oils and frankenfoods that are not even real. So no, I am not saying you'll ever go back to eating the standard American diet. I hope not. The standard American diet is what made you sick. So if you reverse the disease process and now you're asking, can I go back to eating normal? No, you're just going to get sick again. No, like that, especially now that you've aged and your body kind of has that muscle memory to be insulin resistant. If you've been insulin resistant or obese for a really long time, your body remembers really easily what it's like to be obese and pre-diabetic, type 2 diabetic, fatty liver. Not saying that it wants to go back there. That's not normal for the body, but you're more apt to go back there because you've been in that state. Your body's been in that state for a really long time. So no, I don't think you can ever go back to eating normal standard American diet and be disease-free. It's just, those two things don't go together. And I know that it seems like there are people who can, like, so-and-so can eat this way and it never affects them. At some point, the standard American diet catches up with just about everybody. And like, my husband's a good example of this. I've known him since he was 21 years old. And he's just one of those people, not that he's unhealthy, he eats very well, for the most part, because I make his food and I do all the grocery shopping. But he's one of those people who, he just felt like he could eat or drink whatever he pleased. And he'd always, wake up the next day and have no ramifications. He didn't know what it was like to be bloated. He didn't gain weight after, drinking beer and eating pizza on the weekend. Like, it just never seemed to affect him. And he'd fluctuate for like 5 pounds in the 25 years that I knew him. And not that I wanted him to be sick, but he's just one of those people that you get frustrated with. It's like, why can you drink all that beer and eat that pizza on the weekends? And if I do that, I feel like absolute dog crap. It takes me an entire week to recover from that. But anyway, just now in his late 40s, again, not that he's like ill, but it's coming to the point where he has to be more careful. And he was starting to show some signs of metabolic disease due to, just and I wouldn't say he was eating the standard American diet, but eventually it's going to catch up with just about everyone is basically the main point that I wanted to make. So can we go back to eating 300 grams of carbohydrate? No, I don't think so. I don't think that's a healthy amount. Now, if we look at the USDA guidelines for food, which aren't the standard American diet guidelines, but USDA promotes, healthy whole foods. But I mean, they're promoting healthy whole grains and a lot of dairy and a lot of fruit and some vegetables as the main thing that we're eating. And it's still, even though it's whole food, it's around 300 grams of carbohydrate. I don't think many people can get away with that amount of carbohydrate and still be metabolically healthy. It's just, I think it's a very small percentage of people who can get away with eating that amount of carbohydrate. And I think the people who can have a lot of muscle mass, they're very active, and are not genetically predispositioned to be metabolically ill. So I think it's a small subset. So in my opinion, once you get to the point where you've reversed the disease process, you put it into remission, I think most people can get away with under 100 grams of carbohydrate. That's where I fall. I don't count from day to day, but I only eat 2 meals, and I know I rarely go over 50 grams of carbohydrate in either of those meals. And I target my protein to be at least 50 grams per meal. And then I just, focus on eating a couple of fat sources. But I think under 100 grams can work for a lot of people, especially men. Men have more muscle mass. They're bigger. They have bigger livers. So they have more storage capacity for carbohydrates as well. But I think most people will maintain a disease-free state at 75 grams of carbs or less if they're whole carbohydrates and they're not, crappy processed foods. Women too, we can't eat as much carbohydrate as men typically. But I think that approach can work for a lot of people. And then focusing on high fiber, non-starchy vegetables and fruits as our main source of carbohydrates. That way we're eating a good amount of fiber. We're feeding, the butyrate in our guts. We're feeding the healthy bacteria. All of that is going to help to prevent insulin resistance as well, those healthy microbes. So some people might need to do a ketogenic diet or close to a ketogenic diet long-term, who are more metabolically predispositioned for issues. They might need to do that. I think everybody benefits from intermittent fasting once they've reversed their disease process. So like a 16 to 18 hours of fasting most days, or pretty much every day, that's going to maintain that lower insulin and insulin in the normal range. Some people, OMAD or 1 meal a day can be a good maintenance strategy. I don't like OMAD for weight loss per se, but for a maintenance strategy, it can work for some people quite well. So once we get there, once we get to the disease reversal remission state, our labs are great, we feel good, we are healthy, we are medication free, we need to sustain that lifestyle long term. Maybe not so, maybe we don't need to do those therapeutic fasts anymore. We don't need to keep carbs so low because now we're more metabolically sensitive. But if we go back to the lifestyle that got us sick in the first place, we are going to get sick again. So we just need to keep maintaining, keep these strategies in our life for good. And there's no reason to go back to being metabolically ill again. So I hope that helps put in perspective if you're working on reversing the insulin resistance disease process, what to look for, what labs to request, what to look for in trends, and then what's going to get you there to actually reverse your disease.